welcome to the American Cinema Foundation Movie Podcast. I am your host, Titus, and today in our Europe series, I am joined again by my good friend Flagg Taylor for yet another conversation on totalitarianism in cinema. We have already talked about writer-director couple Petr Jarchovský and Jan Hřebejk when we discussed Učitelka, the 2016 movie The Teacher. It's very theatrical. It really takes place over one evening in one school. It's about the end of communism in Slovakia, about the education of children who would become the first generation of adults in a democratic modern world. Now we turn from The Teacher to Divided We Fall, the 2000 movie that made Hřebejk and Jarchovský famous worldwide, as the movie was nominated for the Oscar. Divided We Fall is a movie about the beginning of totalitarian tyranny, not the end. World War II in Czechoslovakia, it's about the Nazis and eventually the communists, and how not a community, but one family, really. It's a movie about four people who go through these terrible years of World War II together. It's incredibly funny. I say incredibly because it's quite serious about World War II and the threat to life, to moral integrity, and the fear for the future of the nation as a whole. And yet, a Czech specialty, it is very funny and perhaps a lesson in the extent to which comedy is compatible with acknowledgement of a terrible history. Hřebejk and Jarchovský were director-writer couple throughout the 90s. They became very successful early on in the Czech Republic, won recognition and awards, but this was their breakout movie. They have since made others together, including The Teacher, our previous podcast. But I don't think they are sufficiently known worldwide, and the cinema of Central Europe in regards to totalitarianism is not well known. This is a very timely moment for its discovery, since we are much more worried about totalitarianism now than we have been since 1989. So it's a great moment to return to these concerns. And the easiest way, perhaps, is through art, through the dramatization of these great themes that one can also study in the works of political philosophers or of dissidents or of other important scholars doing historical research. Now, that said, Flagg, you introduced me to Jan Hřebejk. In fact, you pointed me to this movie. I'm very glad that you have a chance to talk about it for the podcast, but I think it's right that you should introduce the movie. Tell us how you got to know it and your thoughts on it.
Sure, it's great to be back on the podcast, Titus. I first came across this film through my friend Markéta Goetz-Stankovic, who's a longtime professor of comparative literature at the University of Vancouver. She's long retired. She must be in her late 80s, if not 90 now. I asked her to contribute to my volume of essays on the lives of others, and a few of the essays do some comparisons to other films, and she recommended this film. And I think she recommended it because of her own biography. She's from Bohemia. She and her parents were able to emigrate to Canada, I think the very month that the communists came to power in 1948. This film clearly had some personal connections for her because her father was in Terezin during the war, Theresienstadt, the concentration camp that is spoken of in the movie. Her father then, I think at the end of the war, she told me, was able to walk home from Terezin. He was in some sort of medical quarantine and escaped the quarantine and got home, and they knew that he was home. They had put in place some sort of knocking signal system so that, when he knocked on the door, they knew it was him, but they couldn't believe it was him because they assumed that he had died. And those post-war years were very tumultuous. And she told me that one of the reasons that they decided to try to emigrate was that she and her family could hear the screams at night of the people that the Czech partisans were punishing. So the aftermath of the war was just too tough to stomach for her parents, and they decided to try to take the family to Canada. So she thought that there were some interesting connections between this film and the lives of others, and the effect that totalitarianism can have on people's behavior and people's thinking about themselves and where their loyalties should lie and how one can escape or not escape personal responsibility. I think she was right that this film is, as you said, it's very comic in places, in part due to the skill of the actor who plays the main character, Josef, but it also raises some very deep questions about moral responsibility and suffering and endurance. And so I highly recommend it to our audience.
Indeed, the skill in the movie makes it a delight to watch, even though some of the passages are, of course, quite difficult. I would say that one way in which it differs from the teacher is that it is so strictly focused on one household, Josef and Maria, husband and wife, on the man they take in, David, and of course their strange friend, Horst. This theatrical feel, it's very intimate and at the same time gives great expanse to dialogue, the change of places in the rooms, to physical comedy, to suspense, all of it based on this very small location you very quickly grow used to. And of course, everything from facial expression and the alteration of tone is just intensely intimate in that sense. You see and hear and get to know and get used to these characters, and therefore are much more surprised as the plot changes, because every 30 minutes you think you've figured them out, and it turns out that there's something more that's happening, that there's some other trouble that comes along that reveals more about them. Kind of makes sense. You have a grasp of these characters from very early on, but at the same time, it's still full of surprises because you're not there yet. You haven't fully grasped what it is that the writer and director want to show you. And I think that's supposed to make us realize to what extent humanity is endangered, but in certain ways preserved, going through the terrible things in the world war. So it's a deeply humanistic movie in that sense. Beyond that, I would say that the insistence on private life is also supposed to suggest that we should be much more skeptical of public statements and in a way of rumors, which are not quite public, not quite private, because people's motivations are harder to understand. And it is much easier for us to turn to ideology and a partisan stance than it is to enter into the secret councils of the heart, so to speak. What is it that really moved these people? What were their intentions? And yet, if you want to rescue to some extent the humanity of people caught in historical drama, that's absolutely necessary. And given that in modern times, our lives are not exactly ruled by a few great rulers, there's no prince or king or whoever who is responsible for us. We have, on the other hand, to take on this responsibility of figuring out what it is that does move people and where you might look for certain virtues, even if they are on a small scale rather than on the heroic scale. That, I think, also makes it somewhat more comic. It's not as tragic as it would be if you were to tell the story of Czechoslovakia in World War II, which would be grim. And therefore, I think it's not intended to replace history, but to correct a certain tendency in political history. It is a very necessary study, but it does tend to create a certain grimness in affairs and a certain inability to understand what people say in our grandfather's generation were like and what they went through. After all, this is World War II. The movie was made in 2000. Many people who lived through the war were still alive. It was just 55 years from the end of the war. But in a way, it's a different world already. I would say several different worlds passed, since communism was also already becoming hard to grasp and hard to understand. How did this happen? In that sense, the movie is intended, in correcting history, to give us a deeper political appreciation of what it takes for people to get through drama, what it takes, therefore, for us to understand any kind of historical continuity and maybe have a grasp of the national character, not so much of the regimes, since the experience of the 20th century is that the regimes come and go, incredibly violently perhaps, but they do come and go, and the people are still there.
Yeah, I'll give a brief overview of the plot. I think you put it well when you suggested that the film constantly upends the viewer's kind of settled expectations of where you are and what to expect from certain characters. So it takes some twists and turns that make it really, really interesting and a dramatic movie to watch. The movie, as you said, tells the story of this couple, Josef and Marie. We're in some village in the borderlands of Bohemia, and the action of the movie takes place between 1943 and 1945, when you get the liberation of this area by the Soviet army. The filmmaker Hrebek, he makes an interesting choice trying to set this story in a broader context by including these little snippets of scenes that stretch back, and to get through the opening credits, you get 3 scenes set in 37, 39, 41 that show you the relationship between Josef, this young man, David Wiener, who's a young Jew whose family was fairly wealthy and owned some sort of manufacturing company. Josef and his friend Horst Prohaska worked with him. You see Horst, David, and Joseph in the countryside getting along well, joking with one another. 39, you start to see the appropriation of the Wiener's property. And then 41, you see that many of the Wiener family have been shipped to Theresienstadt, the concentration camp that's north of Prague. And then, of course, in 1943, you see David coming back on the street. Joseph makes the decision to hide him in the cellar. That's the action of the plot, is Joseph and Marie making this decision to hide David, obviously keeping this a secret from the people in the village whom they can't be sure will sell them out. It turns out Horst, who's Joseph's friend, he has a German wife. He has the German name Horst, of course. So he turns out to be someone who takes advantage of his ethnic background and takes a job with the Nazis. Joseph, in turn, once he makes the decision to hide David, agrees to join Horst in working for the Nazis to help him conceal the fact that he might be doing something that he should not. The film really is about moral responsibility, as I said before, and gives you these contrasts between Joseph and Horst, between this other German man named Kepke, who comes in and occupies the Wiener's home. And so the action of the film is watching this drama unfold as Joseph tries to keep this secret as best he can.
Indeed, the decisive point is very early on. You see this meeting in the middle of the night at the old Wiener residence. Joseph meets David and he's shocked. He didn't know that this guy was still alive, much less that he had somehow returned to his family's old mansion. But in a split second, they recognize each other and they have a very brief conversation. And Joseph realizes that he has to take him in. Anything else is probably going to mean death for David. And although he is in a way divided against himself, he realizes this is a very dangerous thing to do. He takes him in and he hides him in his own pantry, which also doubles as a shelter in case of bombing, I guess. There's a lesson about that too. He says many people built these kinds of rooms. Indeed, he tells his Jewish friend, I helped your father build his in your home. A lot of Czechs realized really bad times were going to come and you need a place to hide. That emphasizes the need for secrecy and for private life in dangerous moments, and says a lot about Czechs as a people. It's just a very quick moment. It all passes in 30 seconds. When you think about it, it says a lot about who these people are, and also helps to explain to some extent why, although the danger is so great, Joseph is so quickly willing to take David in. Granted, they were friends, he used to work for David's family, but that doesn't mean you owe somebody to risk your life. The simple fact that private life is to some extent still Czech, whereas public life is under the control of the Nazis, so that even the Czechs, when they look at one another, they want to see who is suspicious, who might be betraying his people by working for the Nazis and all sorts of other things that occur through the plot. You see that really the only place for humanity is in secrecy. And in that sense, very, very quickly, David becomes something like the conscience of not just Joseph, but his wife, Maria. They constantly fight about the fate of this young man. They constantly fight about the burden it puts on them and other things that are going on in their lives that are difficult to deal with. Above all, the fact that they've been married years and they have no children. Clearly, she wants children and kind of denies it. He denies that he wants children, but in fact, he probably wants children as well, we'll learn later on in the plot. But all of these things now take a more serious turn because one family argument, if it gets too loud, could lead to their secret being discovered. And in this case, it would mean their lives. So it's a very good device for dramatizing the conscience, the wrestling with motives and intentions and feelings and regrets and hopes and fears.
Yeah, let me just add one quick thing about Joseph, which I maybe didn't emphasize enough in my initial summary. He is, I think I used the phrase, he makes this decision to harbor David, but that might be even too strong language. Like you said, it happens so quickly in this single moment. I don't know how much time he has to really think about it. It's something that he just seems to do. So that's the first point. And the second point, it's something that he seems to do almost despite himself, right? He comes across as very cynical. The way he speaks to his wife, like you said at the beginning about children, right? He says something like, I can't even imagine how anyone could make the choice to bring children into the world that we inhabit, right? So he's very cynical and doesn't think it makes any sense even to try to perpetuate the human race in the face of what's happening. But his actions are always better than his speech. It's sort of funny to listen to him talk because the way that he talks about himself is betrayed by what he does. So he's much more courageous than he gives himself credit for. It's almost like he, at the beginning of the movie, maybe the first, half hour, 40 minutes or so, you're almost sort of giggling. You find his treatment of himself as comic because he's so much better than he's giving himself credit for. And the contrast with some of the other characters comes across right away. I don't remember his name, but there's a man who sees David on the street after he's escaped from the concentration camp and made his way back. David says something to him by name, and the guy says, "You have to get out of here." Right. Well, you could, if you're seen here and people know that I saw you, this could mean the execution of the whole block. Right. The Germans could decide to execute everyone on the street if they suspect that any one villager is involved with the harboring of this one Jew. And so he turns out to be someone you don't admire too much. On the other hand, he's not wrong about what he says. Again, the contrast comes across starkly with Joseph, and the way he treats David vis-a-vis these other characters. But also you can't help wonder why Joseph doesn't kind of recognize his own decency more.
Yeah, that's right. There's altogether kind of suspicion of how moral our motives really are, and nobody shows that quite as clearly as Joseph, because he's the one who's suspicious of his own motives. And indeed, self-deprecating barely begins to cover his attitude. You can say that partly that's because life hasn't worked out for him. It's not just that he doesn't have a kid, he's disabled because he helped build some stuff during the war, some projects, and he got hit by, I guess, a bomb or rather shrapnel from an explosion, and it destroyed his leg, and so now he's limping through life. And you wonder, what was it for? The meaninglessness of the kind of suffering that he personally went through, but of course of the war more broadly, would be enough to take any intelligent man's convictions and shake the morality out of them, more or less. You're right that throughout the movie he does the right thing, but he's constantly quite cynical about it. And that would seem to be partly because he doesn't know that any of this is going to work, and because the risks he's taking might lead to bad things, and not just for himself, for his wife, for other people. He doesn't know if it's the right thing to do. The uncertainty and the danger shake the certainty we have about the morality of our actions, since it's somehow part of morality that also things work out. Morality has to be good for human beings ultimately, otherwise it would be anti-human. And yet in the circumstances, it's very hard to believe that these things will work out. But without your moral principles, you don't even know what to do. With your moral principles, you can tell that you're doing very risky stuff and you might end up dead. Without them, what other guide do you even have? It's not a good situation to be in. And so he constantly grumbles about the consequences of his actions because of the danger he brings about. But at the same time, he can't do otherwise. So he's constantly quarreling with himself. As you say, his deeds speak against his words and give you this a deeper portrait of who the guy is. He's not committed to any kind of public anything. He just wants to get himself and his wife through the war, but he's not willing to do so in an immoral way. And especially when there's this kind of moment of life and death, suddenly you see that his moral convictions are quite strong. Perhaps that's one reason why he needs to talk in this somewhat cynical manner. His convictions could run away with him. He might need to put a damper on things because you could say his speeches are always introducing circumstances, present realities that his heart might not want to acknowledge. That is to say, all the danger and all the compromises that are necessary to survive in such a situation. He cannot be satisfied with himself because the only ways to sort of solve the conflict between his deeds and his speeches would be either to do something heroic and get himself and his wife killed, possibly his neighbors, etc., or on the other hand, to become not merely compromised but corrupt and lose his soul. And so he somehow manages to live with the conflict instead.
Yeah, the contrast with Horst, I think, is interesting. So Horst, again, is this character has this ethnically German wife. He clearly speaks German, and so he clearly makes what seems to be like a conscious decision to join what he thinks is the winning side. In one of the opening scenes, you see him exulting in the movements of the German army, and he uses sausages on the table to talk about the movement of troops and how the Reich is going to have this great victory, and you're sort of repulsed at this point. And he involves himself in the appropriation of the property of the Czech villagers for purposes of the Germans who have now moved into the village. So he's maybe repellent would be too strong, but he clearly makes these public compromises in an openly self-interested way. He's sort of the opposite of Joseph. He's all public professions will save me, and it doesn't really matter if I believe this stuff or not. I should say too, the other plot element that we should get on the table that we haven't spoken about is this question of birth and childbearing. So the movie opens, as you said, with this acknowledgement that they can't seem to have children. It's not clear why. He makes this public statement not public statement, but he makes this statement to his wife that I can't imagine bringing a child in this world, but she clearly wants children. The plot twist that emerges very unexpectedly later in the film is when Horst, who clearly has a kind of crush on Marie, takes Marie on a kind of lunch outing and eventually tries to rape her. And the only way that Marie can think of to stop this after she punches him is to say that she can't allow him to do it because she's expecting a child. She knows she's not pregnant, of course, but she says it to try to prevent him from continuing with his efforts to rape her. That then plot element is continued when we learn near the end of the movie that the fate of the Germans is changing. This guy, Kepka, now has to move out of the Wiener house. His youngest son has been shot while trying to desert, so he can't have this great house. And so Horst suggests that this guy Kepka move in with Joseph and Marie. And then Marie repeats the lie that she's pregnant, then saying, we need this extra room for this child that's coming. This is the first Joseph has heard of this lie. So he's standing there sort of stunned, but is smart enough to go along with the lie. And so the way that they, eventually they know that the lie is going to be found out because Joseph can't, we've since found out that he's sterile. So he's the reason why they can't have children. And so now they come up with the solution that David should impregnate Marie. And so this is this theme of childbirth and the possibility of a new world, right, comes to the fore. And that's the plot twist that I think is most interesting and shocking, kind of really puts you back on your heels. When Marie is, you're in that horrible scene when Horst is making these advances and eventually tries to rape her. You're just completely disgusted with Horst, of course, and then you're just shocked that Marie comes out with this lie because you think, oh my gosh, they can't possibly get out of this. And so it's a great decision, I think, by Hrebeck to add this plot element.
The going along through the drama of secrecy, lest your neighbors, lest the Nazis find out that you're harboring a Jew, that brings a certain tension with it, but it doesn't really say anything about the broader issue that concerns the Czechs, the national future really beyond the war. This is what the birth is about, after all. It's new life, it's a future, it's life that's untainted by the misery that the parents are suffering through. It's a hope. The wife, on the one hand, she has to try to defend herself that way, saying she's actually pregnant. But at the same time, Joseph, the husband, he goes to the doctor. He's been pushed to it, so to speak, and he does want to go to the doctor and be tested to find out, is he or is he not sterile? And so you can see that it's actually weighing on him too. Although he had denied it before, you could say that there's nothing in the drama of the war that moves him in this direction. It's him. It's something that's been on his mind, and he accepts to work for the Germans in some minor capacity in order, as you said, to hide the fact that he's doing something anti-German. But that compromise once made also opens this possibility of going to visit a German doctor. And there's this grim irony that the doctor is famous for sterilizations, and it turns out that here's a man he doesn't even need to bother to sterilize because he's sterile. And so somehow the notion of birth is over against this problem. it was of the essence of the Nazi war plan to sterilize entire populations and then to execute entire populations, to put an end to races, no more birth. And so it has some kind of symbolic importance for the war as a whole and for the Czech nation in particular, that they survived, they lived. That means new life came into this world. Then there is also this other aspect of it that is incredibly comic, that they're all very embarrassed of themselves, but it is the husband to be cuckolded, Joseph, who is the one who keeps insisting that no, David, who is a very meek character, gaunt, as you might expect somebody who survived the concentration camp, shell-shocked, I guess. And then on the other hand, his wife, who is a fairly strong and determined woman, but for that very reason starts crying and is more than embarrassed by the problem they have gotten themselves into, and the solution he is not merely contemplating, but more or less forcing on them. And of course, it's also a theological joke that Joseph and Mary are going to have a child, but it's not Joseph's child, he's cuckolded. You may look at this in a more Christian light, you may look at it in an atheistic light and make light of the Christian story of the nativity, but that's obviously what's at stake there. Especially because, again, it doesn't really have anything to do with what was happening in the story prior to that moment. But however you look at it, the importance of the symbol is that it would not be enough for the Czechs to have kids, to have a future. They would also have to have a faith, and they would have to have some kind of miracle. That is to say, there's got to be something that guarantees that birth is not going to be, people have been born since who knows when, and it didn't prevent things like world wars from happening and horror. Why would this world new birth be any better? It relies on a certain hope in divine providence. And so that somehow is what underlies what's going on in the story and the importance of this Jewish man that they are harboring and who turns out to be necessary to their salvation more than once. So that again is how the plot works. There are these twists, and the defenseless Jewish man who escaped the concentration camp only to be locked in another cell, he turns out to be in fact the condition and then the cause of their salvation later on. That's somehow part of why the movie is called what it's called. We must help each other. The English translation for baffling reasons is divided we fall, as you said, but that's not what it means. There's this phrase that they keep using in the movie, and whenever it appears, we must help each other, there's something more than a little disturbing about it, partly because of the self-interest of the people saying that, partly because it's just hard to take on its face. Given the terrible war circumstances, what mutual help can there be? What mutual good can there be? But in the order of the plot, by the introduction of this supernatural suggestion, there in fact turns out to be a way for people to help each other. And again, that's something that maybe the humanism of the plot in some sense does depend on a deeper Christian hope, because somehow all of these people will have to live with each other after the war. This is not a story about taking revenge on the collaborators or rejoicing in the destruction of the oppressors and so on and so forth, because that doesn't really tell the victims, if they survive, how to deal with their own affairs. So victory in the narrow sense might not be enough. It would have to perhaps be a victory of a higher character. And maybe that emerges best through comparison with this character, Horst. He's a German in these Czech lands, and he complains that he's always been maltreated and that people used to mock him as Wurst. Well, he's mocking them now. He's the guy who gets the goods. He's the guy who's got coffee, who's got sausage, who's got all sorts of goods that other people don't get, given the deprivation of the war and the particular humiliations that people suffer from under Nazi rule. So he feels like he's taken revenge on people. He has taken his resentment out, but also his envy. And part of, to some extent, Horst is funny, and to some extent he tries to be a friend, but he also tries to rape his wife's friend, his friend's wife. And there you see what it might mean for people to try to just settle their scores. He's not a Nazi. He doesn't believe in any of this nonsense. He can't even love his own wife anymore because she's a Nazi. And that somehow says something good about his character. But on the other hand, you see that this need to settle scores, he was the least of people in the workshop that the Jewish family owned. And now he's running it. He's very proud of himself for that. This need to settle scores, to come out on top when you are on the bottom, to avenge your resentments, This is what it leads to a very petty man whose only redeeming quality is that in failing to betray his friend and rape his wife, he has a strange chance to be redeemed by them. The fact that he ends up delivering Marie's baby, and indeed he's saved from a jail cell where the communists partisans keep the people they're about to shoot by Josef, who knows what Horst has done, again points out that you might need something that goes beyond justice. And I mean, if a defensive word is unjust, it's hard to find anything that is just. But even with justice, this might not be enough. You might need some kind of mercy, and so perhaps that's why you need to take a higher view of things. And as you mentioned, there's somebody even worse than Horst, which is Kepke, the German guy who takes over the mansion of the Jews, and he is quite proud of his sons who are dying for the German cause. But as things go by, there's less and less to be proud of and more to fear, and his sons are dead and he's losing his mind over it. And eventually he sends off his teenage son to war. In the desperate months of 45, this is true. Germans sent a lot of teenagers to fight.
Well, and I would add, just add that teenager might even be generous. I mean, from the looks of that boy, he couldn't be more than 12. Hrebeck wants to say this seems like an odd choice to send this young boy. I mean, he's a boy, really. He's not.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And his father salutes him with the Heil Hitler, but then picks him up in his arms and kisses him. There's all the tension you can possibly put in things in between those two gestures. But he sends him off to war, and the boy runs in fear, and as a deserter, he gets shot, and his family is dishonored, and Kepke goes mad. Then you see a certain kind of public profession, a certain kind of political commitment. This is what it could lead to.
Yeah,
you wipe out all of private life, right?
Right.
Saves his private life. This guy who is such a boss for the Germans loses everything, including his sanity.
Just to add to your point on the emphasis on private being kind of the only place that's trustworthy. One quick point about Horst, as repellent as he is, he also makes two key decisions during the course of the film that at least partially redeem him, right? Initially, he takes this job and is appropriating the property of his fellow villagers, and he's exulting in German victories and all of this, and he's associated with this guy Kepke, who's terrible, and so you can see that the villagers look at him with disgust. But at one point in the film, he leans down to pick something up off the street, and he hears through the rain gutter Marie speaking French, and she is being assisted in her French lessons by David. And it's never made clear that Horst explicitly knows that this is a Jew, but he certainly knows from then on that something untoward is going on in that flat, but he never speaks of it to anyone. And so that's one important moment in his favor. And then secondly, when the Germans are on their heels, this is probably early winter, spring 1945, later in the movie, the Germans are panicking. Their forces are retreating in the area. And so they're going through confiscating any food that they can get, and punishing people because they're angry, and they're going into all the flats on the street, and they're about to enter Joseph and Marie's flat. If they did, we can assume they probably would have found David. And Horst says, this is a citizen of the Reich lives here, move it along. So that's the second time he kind of saves them. And so for all his kind of moral repugnance, including the attempted rape, right, he does do at least two things that really save his two friends. And I guess the scene that really struck me as interesting and important, it's early in the film, after Joseph makes the decision to work for the collaborators. Horst looks at Joseph and says, you have to learn to adjust your face to give this expression of loyalty. And he gives, and I mean, the facial expression that Horst gives is brilliant, because it's not the facial expression of a militant enthusiast. What I saw, it's the facial expression of just utter vacancy. Right. And so it's kind of a comic, it's a comic moment, because you're like, you don't look loyal, you look stupid. And then you see Joseph try to adjust his face, and Horst looks at him and says, yes, that's what I'm after. And so this whole thing, right, is, again, as you emphasize, it's not because he's a Nazi. He's just trying to adjust his behavior to do what he can to survive. And maybe that's not enough and enables him, or not enables, but it doesn't prevent him from doing utterly repellent stuff like trying to rape the wife of his best friend. But you can see the difficult calculations that he's gone through in his own mind. And as you alluded to, he seems to find his own wife distasteful because she wants to move back to Germany, right? And he's like, I don't want to move back to Germany. Who would want to live in Germany? So he's just, the more I think about it, the more interesting character Horst is.
Yeah, there is something human about him, because in his petty way, Horst embodies a principle of love of one's own. He saves his friends' lives because they're his friends. It's not a matter of principle. There's no reason to think he'd have done the same for their neighbors, but he does do it for them. And indeed, he tries to instruct Josef into how to pretend to be part of the Nazis. The best he can come up with is indeed a blank stare. But since that avoids any defiance and it avoids the confrontational character of intelligence, it's actually exactly right. It's more obviously possible for a stupid person like Horst than for an intelligent person like Josef. But that only makes it even more necessary for an intelligent person to dissimulate, to hide. Josef is somewhat cynical, and that's a dangerous quality to have under a tyranny. Mocking a tyrant or the tyranny or the soldiery or what have you, that is unsafe at the best of times. So in that sense, Horst is trying to be protective of his friend, and his advice is not at all bad. Indeed, he says he doesn't want to leave Bohemia because, for better or worse, that's all he knows. That's his place. He wants to stay there. Of course, his conviction that the Germans are going to win is also shaken gradually. He's much less confident that after the war, it would be really great to be in Germany. But of course, also, would it be great for collaborators like him to be in Czechoslovakia? That is the other danger. And he's quite a fearful guy, tyrannic when he can be, because he caricatures a certain principle of justice, which we can state theoretically as help your friends, harm your enemies. That requires a certain eulogy of strength. This is, you could say, why he can't help himself but tries to rape his friend's wife. He thinks, sure, they're friends, but he's the stronger of the two. And his friend depends on him for all these things that he brings. And so he deserves something in return. He doesn't deserve just to be mocked by his friend. It doesn't occur to him that his strength is not real and he might be in need of salvation himself soon enough. It's very narrow-minded, but it's a character of that principle of love of one's own that issues in the politics of helping your friends and harming your enemies, without which no community can survive. You have to defend yourself. Josef is comparatively much more contemplative, much more intelligent, but it makes him cynical and also paralyzed. Horst is not wrong to complain that Josef does nothing. And doing nothing seems safe to an extent, but only to the extent to which the tyranny allows you to do nothing. And of course, to the extent to which your community allows you to do nothing. This sort of apolitical attitude is doomed, actually.
Yeah, we should say too, now that I think about it, that important, I emphasize the initial choice to harbor David really isn't a choice, I don't think. The decision to join Horst in this job appropriating property, that is more of a decision, an actual decision, and it's his wife that pushes him in that direction. She's the one who says, well, if it's going to help you enable you to hide the fact that we're harboring this Jew, then maybe you should do it. But his moral compass doesn't want any compromise, any involvement with these Nazis. And then you can sort of see the importance of that choice and the mark it leaves on him later in the movie when he walks up to a woman who lives across the street from him, who he sees, I think when he comes out of the doctor's office, and he says he's trying to convince her that his public actions with his involvement with the Nazis doesn't really reflect who he is, right? So he's saying, I'm not as bad as you think I am, right? I'll tell you why later. And right as he finishes this, the Nazi guy who he had helped early in the movie fix his car comes by and says, "Hey, old friend, good to see you." So of course, his efforts to denazify himself completely fail. But it just shows you I think that the film loves to play with this idea of the problematic nature of public professions, right, in the context of totalitarianism. the insufficiency of what looked to be kind of self-evident loyalties, right? And you could see it took a long time for Czechs to wrestle with this legacy, right? Lots of people criticized Havel when he makes the decision in the 90s to apologize for the expulsion of the Germans, right? And you can see that anger comes out at the end of the film when the Czech partisans and communists are, going around drawing swastikas on people's back, Horst among them. And, you wonder whether all the people who they rounded up and grouped in this kind of makeshift prison, really deserve it. And of course, this is the moment when Josef identifies Horst as a doctor so he can help save his wife. So yeah, that aspect of kind of the post-war difficulty of navigating this moral universe is, as you mentioned, it's going to be a tough few years for Czechs.
Yes, indeed. The scene to which you alluded to when Josef helps a Nazi is a very good example of this problem. At first, he only takes his Jewish former coworker, or rather the son of his boss, on a short-term basis, because the man says, I have a friend, I'm supposed to meet him. We're supposed to run away together. I'm just here to get some of the family property, some jewels to run away with. So Josef borrows a car from Horst and puts David in the trunk and drives him to the forest where he's supposed to meet his friend who doesn't show up. And one is left to think it's probably because he's never going to show up ever. It happened. And David, nevertheless, is resolute. He's already escaped the concentration camp. So he wants to go in the rain in the forest by himself. And Josef just can't fathom that. And then again, by necessity, the circumstances are so terrible. He just takes him in and says, get back in the trunk. We'll get back into town. And as they try to get back to their little town, they're stopped by Germans who need help. They need help with a wrench. And Josef realizes that the quickest way to save the Jewish fellow is to help the Nazis. And so he helps them get on their way. He's very polite and quick with a wrench. And that's how they get out of it. But indeed, it comes to bite him in the back. And the broader level, there is his neighbor that you mentioned, the man in the beginning, František, who sees the Jew and calls out to the soldiers, hey, there's a Jew. And the soldiers don't want to come. They didn't hear him. They're going the other way. But that's who František is. In fear for his own neighborhood and himself, he denounces. But he later sees that Josef has accepted to work for the collaborators. And at the end, he marks Josef as a collaborator for the sake of the communists who are looking for people to murder, barely saved by the fact that he had a Jew hidden. The communist very cynically comments, everybody had a Jew or a partisan hidden, it turns out these days. Everybody was innocent. Everybody was actually heroic secretly. He's quite cynical about this stuff with the kind of phrase that one would have expected from Josef himself at an earlier part of the movie. But in this case, they really did have this Jewish guy hiding in their pantry and who therefore saves them from execution by communists. And at the end, it's the Jewish guy who sort of judges these people summarily. He says, Horst knew about me all along. He brought me food. He's a good guy. He's a decent guy. He's one of us. But he also has an exchange of glances with František, who had been the man who denounced him and who is still denouncing people, not because he had any high moral standing, but because he is very moralistic. Why is he so moralistic? Exactly for the reason he said. He is afraid that he himself will be punished. If he doesn't punish somebody else, he himself will get punished. And that is not far from the principle that Horst himself follows. You have to help your friends harm your enemies. Somebody's going to get hurt, and it better be them, not you. And so you see both on the partisan and the collaborationist side, this dangerous moralism that comes from fear, even from a tinge of despair, and that shows up in trying to hurt other people in as public and authoritative a manner as possible, lest you yourself be hurt instead. It's the uncertainty that paralyzes Josef drives these people, Horst and this František, to even more dangerous things. Since the movie is so much about private life, private life under Nazism, private life under communism, private life during the war and regime change, it reveals so much of the fears and the uncertainties and the dangers to morality. How people who are not bad in ordinary times turn out to be bad when the times become extreme. This is the philosophic remark Joseph makes to David at the beginning. Things have changed. You can't trust your neighbors these days. You'd be surprised what people can be brought to do. And he's saying this to this Jewish guy who just got out of Theresienstadt. I don't think you'd be surprised, Joseph.
Yeah.
But he is saying what he himself has learned through the little misery of the
Yeah, doesn't David say something in reply like, yeah, I'm not surprised by any of that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the movie tries to show how compromising the situation really is morally, not least of all, precisely as you suggested in the case of Havel, so that people become able to admit some of the dark truths about themselves rather than try to take them out as vengeance on somebody else. It's supposed to be a corrective to the necessary demands of justice, which could make us too cruel. This is why I said that to some extent it's a very intellectual thing, hence the protagonist Yosef, and to some extent it appeals to Christianity, hence the Jewish hope and the Yosef and Mary couple.
Yeah, the so-called liberation at the end, right, is treated by Hrebeck not really as a liberation, but I would even say as a kind of continuation of Nazi rule almost, right? I mean, it's really a kind of dark portrayal of what, must have felt like an actual liberation for many people. And I love the scene that you mentioned with David and František are sitting on a couch in the living room next to one another. František has this armband that suggests that he was a resistance fighter, and it's almost like he's trying to hide it from David, that he's so ashamed. And František is this character too that has somehow managed to find a way to survive and not get caught up with any of the authorities, but you can see like his inaction, his efforts to blend in have kind of compromised him in a deep, I think the film suggests in a very deep way. Like you're almost more repulsed by him than you are Horst in a funny way.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for the fact these are two alternatives to how you might become corrupt, and it reveals that it's the situation is a lot more unpleasant than people will admit. And this is not the kind of problem people could have dealt with in 1945 when events were cataclysmic. But afterwards, when you try to understand what happened, this sort of sophisticated judgment about people's private motivations makes a lot more sense. And in a way, it's necessary simply to be able to understand what happened seriously, rather than reduce it to yet another slogan. In the first part of the movie, Horst and Josef keep badgering each other about who's a hero and how cynical they both are in certain ways about heroism, if for somewhat different reasons. Horst is a fairly immoral guy, but he embodies the morality of politics. Josef has much more moral spine, but on the other hand, his reasoning is more or less amoral. He doesn't want to hurt anybody, but he doesn't subscribe to any politics, so to speak. He doesn't subscribe to any principle that would articulate a community. He just bickers. And because of that, both of them can be anti-heroism. But for that reason also, they're both, so to speak, humble enough that they're happy to have survived. And they realize they owe each other's lives. At the different moments, they save each other's lives. And they're not any less at odds and ends with each other. But they realize that you still have to save the other guy's life. It's important to say that these are the people you know, to make sure that there's something left of your own humanity, that you don't look at other people as disposable, much less start pointing fingers like František does, starts wanting to have people executed on his authority, that he pretended to be obedient to the Nazis, and indeed was, and now he's pretending to be obedient to the communists, would be somewhat despicable, but not impossible to understand. But pointing fingers at people to be executed shows how this turns into madness, how fear turns into madness, and cowardice turns to violence and even a kind of ruthlessness. And indeed, it needs chastising as quietly as possible in the circumstances. But as you said, it's a man who's quite ashamed of himself. And so this complexity of motives in the story, I think is supposed to not just explain why did things happen that way, but also to dampen some of the moral judgments and maybe also some of the hopes. In a way, it's a shocking thing, right? This is a movie made in 2000 that essentially tells people that collaboration with the Nazis wasn't always so bad, And that is a very shocking thing to say. Europe has abandoned Christianity, has abandoned morality, broadly speaking. But if you call somebody a Nazi, even more than in America, it's catastrophic. Many European countries ban Nazi speech. Of course, Nazi parties are banned. It's the only thing people really believe in. And so the power of that symbol is what Hrebeck and Markovsky are aiming at. They want to show that it's not something people should be so moralistic about, because it gives them, like with František, it gives them an unearned confidence and an eagerness even to blame other people and to punish other people.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would maybe add just one thought in support of that point, and maybe make a little more concrete what I think Hrebeck might be up to. Maybe what he's after too is to remind the audience of the kind of necessary concreteness of all moral choice and moral action, right? It's very hard to abstract and impose general moral rules, especially in the conditions that are as strange and difficult as, the clashing of totalitarianisms in World War II. So yeah, I think that's got to be part of what he's after. I like that point about the easy moralism of being anti-Nazi, and I mean it's so obvious as to be a kind of truism, but I think you're right. Maybe he's saying, well, let's step back and think through what it might have meant to live through this stuff, and maybe we can make Horst and František and even Kepka understandable.
Yeah, that's just a necessity. A serious study of human nature, a serious study of society, a serious study of politics would have to explain the motives, would have to give a convincing causal account of what happened. But we don't have such things. Just say, well, these people, they're Nazis and they're bad. Well, first of all, that so to speak goes against the way we judge things. Our lives are largely private lives. We don't live for the sake of a party or a political cause or a political leader. We don't identify with these things such that they consume our lives. Our lives are largely private lives. And therefore, we have to investigate our motives, and we have to investigate how massive political events of a public character affect our private lives. You can't really blame people, except in the sense that they are passively consenting, because their lives are private rather than public. And this is forgotten for the strict purpose of calling people fascists or Nazis or so forth, and to treat these things as absolute evils. And of course, one should never forget that the kind of people who like to blame other people as Nazis are still to this day making excuses for communists. Terror that was so long-lived that it swallowed up generation after generation and put up hecatomb after hecatomb, untold millions. But that's easily excusable, it turns out. You have to start thinking in a more complex way about the problems of I don't know what. But they never take that attitude to the Nazis.
Right.
Now, one should be against tyranny in principle, and one should protect political freedom in principle. But blaming the ordinary losers,
and I guess I would add too that the greatness and ambition of Hrebeck comes out because it doesn't, what you've just been emphasizing, never descends even close to a kind of relativism or non-judgmentalism, right? The evil nature of the Nazi enterprise is on full display throughout the movie, sometimes more explicitly than others, but two moments in particular. You've already alluded to the statement about mass, sterilization, and then I think the most chilling moment of the film is when David recounts what happened to his sister at a camp in Poland, right? And we learn that his sister was offered to be a capo, meaning a kind of Jewish guard that would keep the prisoners in line, and in exchange, right, they would probably get better food and housing, essentially a way to kind of guarantee your life. The bad news is, right, you would have had to do all sorts of horrible things to your fellow Jews, but the Nazis said she could only be a capo if she beat her parents to death. And David says that her parents, in fact, pleaded with the daughter to do it. So it's, unimaginable cruelty, right, on a scale that you just don't you don't see very often in the 20th century, as horrible as it is. So again, it's not like Hrebeck is saying, the Nazis, weren't as bad as you thought. No, they're as bad as you thought, but still, right, think through the moral choices that had to be made in those circumstances, and maybe things aren't as easy as you think they are.
Because after all of these places were occupied by the Nazis, by the Soviets, or by both. You can't damn everybody for a communist or a Nazi. They were just occupied. A lot of the collaboration, although cowardly, although unmanly, is not impossible to understand. And under the circumstances, it was close to inevitable. There's some room for private life. There's some room for humanity left, but there's not much. Partly, I think that's why Hrebeck and Markowski are so intent through the writing and the dramatization to show you there was some humanity in their lives, okay? The squeezed as they were to the limit, there were people desperately trying to find one human thing to which to hold on as good and in a way even sacred, something that you could not possibly transgress against. And that's what the movie is about, really. And I think he's suggesting that that's a much better basis for national community, for morality, even for a kind of European peace, than this kind of notion that is at the core of the European Union, which is you either do whatever they tell you in Brussels or you're a Nazi. You either approve all these things or you are a Nazi. You either have more EU or it's going to be World War III. It's not just that the moral blackmail is perpetrated essentially by cowards. These are pathetic people. People going around calling people Nazis never fought the real Nazis. Indeed, they're in the business of calling the people who fought the real Nazis, Nazis. But even if they had any moral standing to make any of these claims, it would be basing a community on this kind of horror. Mm-hmm. It goes to the greatest extent possible for storytelling to suggest that community should be based in something else. It should be some kind of mutual forgiveness for mutual help, and also some hope that there will be moral innocence ahead. To the extent possible for human beings, there are things to be hopeful about. And you're right, I think it's very important that the really disturbing stuff comes at the beginning to set the scene and to tell you what your moral hopes should be. Partly, I would say one reason people are so moralistic in our times, they're very hysterical about certain moral claims. In Europe, it's primarily environmentalism. This is what has replaced Christianity as a religion. Elites in Europe believe in one thing, and it's the environment, and they fear one thing, which is global warming. And they don't even realize that that's inhuman, because it's all they can have by way of morality. It doesn't occur to them that that comes from the fact that they simply have too high a hope. Life is a lot harder than people realize. And in a way, Hrebeck and Markowski are pointing out that we've already forgotten. This is a movie made by Czechs for Czechs, say more broadly for Europeans, people who have suffered from the Nazis and communists and who would know these things, but perhaps more broadly for anybody intelligent, sensitive, and interested. But it's also there because it's 2011 years after the Berlin Wall fell. People are already forgetting. People have insanely high hopes of what society can be, of what the situation can be. Whereas in fact, the human situation is often terrible, rarely as terrible as World War II, but often terrible. And therefore, people's hopes should be more modest. In a shocking way, what you see in the story you recounted about the family is the self-destruction of morality. Each part wants to sacrifice for the sake of the other, and all end up sacrificed. They stayed pure, but there was no survival. And so there's this question, will morality ever work? You have to accept in those cases where that's possible and it's necessary, certain compromise. Mm-hmm. Practical affairs will always require compromises. And in some cases, the compromises are shocking. But you also have to look to see were these actions compromises in the name of saving something of humanity, or were they not? You'd have to give people the benefit of the doubt, but as the story does, investigate their motives. Is there something redeemable in this? Is there something that proves there's some good things in humanity after all, that you can understand principles of political organization, of family, of personal loyalty, friendship, so on and so forth? Those are much more modest than the laudatory and the hysterical denunciations of our times or of those times. But in being modest, they're also a lot more serious, which I think is why when we see these characters, we spend 2 hours with them and we become convinced that it's pretty plausible. This is a better account of what human beings really go through. It's never shrill, but it's convincing.
Titus, do you have any opinions on Hřebík's choice of the kind of scope or mechanics of telling this story? I was just thinking that the alternative to the way that he approached telling the story maybe is Polakowski's Cold War, where he's telling similar story about moral responsibility, but the moments that are explored in each time frame are, I guess, more evenly divided, right? So there's a 48 segment, there's a early 50s segment, there's a later segment, and so I'm just wondering what you think, why Hřebík decided not to do that, and sort of, he could have given you, for example, a much fuller picture of the Wiener family in 1937 and 1939, and maybe that would have been made the film more weighty and interesting because you're really invested in, not that you're not invested in David, but to the extent that you know him better and his family better, you would maybe have been more shocked by his fate. But he doesn't do that, right? As I mentioned at the beginning in my sort of plot summary, right? The 37, 39, 41. All of that is handled in the span of probably 6 or 7 minutes as the opening credits unroll. So I don't know, any just thoughts on how he handles the scope of the story and why he kind of telescopes that beginning part so much?
I think you're absolutely right. This is a very important question about the structure of the storytelling. So altogether, it is in 3 parts. There's this brief introduction that leads us to the war. Most of the movie takes place in the year 1943. And then we skip from the beginning to the end of the pregnancy, which is also the end of the war. And I think the first one is so short for 2 reasons. One of them, the plight of the Jews in Europe has been documented and monumentalized to the extent to which monuments can do that and taught in schools and so on and so forth. So it doesn't need dwelling on. And in a way, I suppose it would end up being the story. So it's treated fairly briefly as a story of the descent of the Czechoslovaks into tyranny and abjection, in the person of that František fellow especially. And most of the movie is about this turning point in the war. There's a kind of joke about it. You mentioned that Horst, the unbelieving Nazi collaborator, he tries to explain what's happening on the Eastern Front by, so to speak, a battle of a plate and a string of sausages. The string of sausages are the Reich's forces. And it doesn't seem to occur to him that when he prepares to eat them at the end, he tears the sausages apart from the strings and says, these are the Germans, these are the Italians, and these are volunteers from Spain. He's tearing them apart and he's going to eat them. The Germans are losing. This is 1943. There's not going to be German offensives on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, he mentioned Stalingrad. Yeah,
exactly. The Russians are coming. The tide of the war has turned, really. That therefore forces the question, what will there be when the Soviets destroy the Germans in the East? Who will these people be, these Czechoslovaks? What will come of them once the occupation of the Nazis is over? What's going to be left? Somehow, I think most of the movie focuses on that issue. Will there be anything moral, humane, something that you could be proud of or approve of left on the basis of which people could build? And of course, also the end of the movie, 1945, has to be short for similar reasons. Not that people talk about communism the way they do about Nazism, far from it. It's largely swept under the rug and it's a damn shame. But it would, on the one hand, end up being the story, how the Czechoslovaks escaped one tyranny only to be stuck with another, and how high hopes in some kind of popular freedom turned into a terror state and show trials, and eventually this evil oligarchic and bureaucratic tyranny that's trying to suck the souls out of people without killing them. That would end up being the story. So you have to be quite discreet and only show the minimum of violence of 1945 and the dangers of communism. At either end, there's a danger that the Czechs will be forgotten. And this is, first of all, a movie made by Czech writers and directors and cast for the sake of Czech national memory, wrestling with the past that might help them understand themselves better and have a more serious grounding for themselves as a political community. So mostly it has to focus on this turning point in the war when it's plausible that they'll get rid of the Nazis, but they have to ask themselves, who will they be? How will they get through this stuff? And will they be able to deal with what we know is coming? That's part of the irony of the movie, that the liberation is to some extent presented as a good thing because to some extent it was. But we all know that 45 is not the end of tyranny in Czechoslovakia. These people are not going to be happy and free now. what's coming is going to be 40 years of horror. That by itself, I think, is why it's not enough to have a child. It somehow has to be tied up with Jesus. The hope that will get people through would probably have to have a deeper meaning than something like, hey, we got revenge on the Nazis.
Yeah.
Nazis are evil, but they lost. It's not enough.
Yeah, I think that's true. And yeah, as I said, I think that the liberation is handled not really as a liberation, but it's, similar ugliness to what we've already witnessed in the movie. So
yeah, and I think partly the solidarity between people who betrayed each other before, there was a lot of ill will between these people. There were a lot of ill deeds, but in a certain way, they have to be solidary with each other. How is that possible? Well, it's because they traded one tyranny for another.
Yeah, well, and
they
solidarity.
This one too.
Right. Solidarity based on hatred is not an enduring kind of solidarity. You have the scene where Kepka is at the moment of liberation is kind of tied up in the town square, and the Czech partisans are allowing mothers to come up with their children to kind of spit on him and slap him. And it's, you're just, of course, you don't have a terrible amount of sympathy for Kepka, but you're also kind of disgusted by the people who would stand in line to smack this pathetic creature.
Yeah, it's again an ambiguous scene because this guy deserves it. And these people, you can understand why they're so furious and hateful. But you wonder, is this going to be okay for them later? I don't think so.
Yeah.
And of course, in the story that Kepka's wife is mad in an asylum and his sons were killed, some by the Soviets, some by the Nazis. He's lost everything. He has been punished. That deals with the question of justice. The worst of the perpetrators that we see, then to the extent to which anybody does, he stands in for Nazi rule, he is punished. But all of these scenes have this ambiguity. There's a moment when Kepka has this chilling statement. This German guy says, somebody calculated scientifically that the life of one German is worth the life of 20 Slavs and the life of 100 Jews. That's the rate of conversion. That's how much they're willing to exterminate and what the losses they're willing to incur. It's horrible and speaks truly to what the times were and what the Nazis were. But it's also the statement of a guy who just lost his son or his second one. So there's something bitter and revengeful about it, but it's not really the statement of a guy looking to exterminate anybody. Again, it points out that most of these people were not the regime. It's necessary to see that to understand what happened to Europe in the 30s and the 40s. I was, especially watching it again, convinced that Rebecca and Yarhovsky were very serious about this attempt to make people somewhat less uppity in their moralism, to make them somewhat more serious about judging morality as accurately as you can. As you're saying, you have to look at the concrete situation. What were the options people had? What were their intentions? People die, you don't know what their intentions were. That's buried with them. And so it has to be reconstructed imaginatively, artistically. It has to be dramatized. And you have to ask yourself, does this make sense as motivation for human beings in such circumstances? And therefore, to investigate your own interiority, to ask yourself about your own motives and your own grasp of what makes people do what they do, what makes you do what you do. It's supposed to make people more serious so that they are better able to make moral judgments. I would say that at least that is one obvious benefit of having survived tyranny. Having gone through these terrible things, at least you should have a much deeper understanding of human nature. It's,
that's true.
It's bought at a terrible price, but that is necessary for any kind of reasonable politics, which would have to mean always look out for the things that are driving people mad, because it does happen. And if you let it happen, the consequences will be unspeakable. As you said, this is not a movie that's relativistic about anything. It's got very serious moral and political intentions, and it's very serious about the distinction between decent people and tyranny. But precisely on the basis of that distinction, it investigates the motives of our actions and tries to show why, although we make public professions of morality all the time, we're not that happy. We don't have a world war, and yet we don't treat each other right. This trouble of human nature is natural. This is who we are. To understand it better might lead us to understand our own predicament and our relationship to the past, such that we do fewer crazy things. In that sense, I believe it's supposed to be partly hopeful, but partly just moderate.
I think that's right.
Make people somewhat more delicate in their judgment and less shrill in their pronouncements. Well, Flagg, I think this brings us to the conclusion of our conversation. This is a wonderful movie, and we could talk about it a lot longer. After all, because we were so concerned with this question of the moral action, we were forced to leave out of discussion almost entirely the wife in the story, Maria. And so we could have an entire conversation about that. But of course, we cannot do everything. And I suppose partly because we are students of political science, we tend to focus on this aspect, the moral political calculus and the circumstances historically in which people act and the intentions of artists, and do not give as much attention to the wife Maria as well. And I believe it's the kind of movie that does allow you, as you watch it again and again, to think about these characters and to get a more complete picture. So I hope that since we have not been able to do everything, our audience will take it upon themselves to watch the movie. It's very enjoyable, and consider the other things that we have to leave out.
Yeah, I agree that poor Maria got short shrift, but there's a lot for the audience to think about with respect to her. The actress is wonderful. She does a terrific job and provides some ballast to Joseph's wavering, I think, at crucial moments in the film. Yeah, the film is wonderful. It pays repeated viewings. I hadn't seen it in probably 4 or 5 years and was glad to. And so I highly, highly recommend it.
Well, Flagg, we should get back to some more of these conversations soon. All the best in the meanwhile, and I hope our audience will join us in watching and appreciating this movie. Take care.
Take care, Titus. Thanks for having me back.